What would you do if you rode into a canyon looking for stray cattle and found a church standing where no church had any right to be? No road led to it. No trail wound down through the rock. No wagon could have hauled its beams and its bell to that lonesome floor of stone and sage. Yet there it stood, weathered and stubborn, its steeple leaning against a sky the color of pewter. Laura Shaw was 22 years old the day she found it, and what she uncovered in the dust around its doors would rewrite everything the town of Dry Creek had refused to remember. Stay close. Settle in. The wind out here carries more than dust. Laura Shaw rode into Dry Creek the way she had left it 3 seasons before, with her father's old carbine wrapped in oilcloth behind her saddle, and her mother's silver locket cold against her breastbone. The town looked smaller than she remembered, or she had grown larger inside her grief. She could not tell which. The false fronts of the mercantile and the assay office sagged a little more each year, their paint peeling in long strips like sunburned skin. A dog she did not know watched her from beneath the boardwalk with amber eyes and did not bark. The livery boy came out squinting, wiping his hands on a rag the color of old blood, and took her mare without a word once he recognized whose girl she was. She had come home because there was nowhere else. Her father had been buried 6 weeks in the little cemetery outside Willow Bend, and the note the bank had pinned to the door of his cabin had been polite and final. The Shaw place was gone. Sold on the courthouse steps to a man with cufflinks and a gold watch chain who had never once run a rope through a gate. Laura had stood at the back of the crowd that morning with her hands tucked inside her sleeves and had watched the auctioneer's hammer come down, and she had felt something inside her chest come down with it. She had not cried. She was not, she had decided long ago, the crying kind. That was why she had ridden the long way south, over the pass and down through the sagebrush flats and into the canyon country her father used to call the Devil's Ledger. Her Uncle Merritt had a small holding at the far edge of it, 3 sections of hard grass and a well that ran cold in July. And he had written her a letter in his slow, careful hand, saying there was work if she wanted it, and a room if she needed one, and no questions asked either way. Laura had folded the letter twice and put it inside her mother's Bible, and she had come. Dry Creek sat at the mouth of the canyons like a tooth in a jaw that had lost most of its others. The town had been bigger once, in the years before the range wars, before the winter of the great die-off, before the 2 big outfits north of the ridge had swallowed up the small places one by one. Laura remembered it fuller. She remembered a schoolhouse with glass in every window and a churchyard where the grass was mowed. She remembered her father lifting her up on the pommel of his saddle so she could see over the heads of the men gathered outside the feed store. And she remembered the low, serious voices they used when they spoke of things she was not yet meant to understand. Some of those voices had gone into the ground. Some had gone west. Some had simply gone quiet. The way men here went quiet when a thing could not be spoken. She walked from the livery to the boarding house with her saddlebags over her shoulder and her hat pulled low against the 4 o'clock sun. 2 women stood on the porch of the millinery and stopped talking when she passed. One of them, a tall, pinched creature in a gray shawl, murmured something to the other behind the back of her hand, and Laura felt the words land against her spine without hearing them. She kept walking. She had learned young that a straight back was the only reply worth giving to a whisper. The boarding house was run by a widow named Hetty Marsh, who had known Laura's mother in the years before either of them was married, and Hetty did not smile when she opened the door, because Hetty had not smiled since 1873. But she took Laura's bags with both hands and set them inside the hall and said, "Your uncle sent word. Supper's at 6. Then she pointed up the stairs and left Laura to climb them alone, The room was small and clean, and smelled faintly of lavender water and old wood. A single window looked out toward the canyons, and Laura stood at it a long time before she took off her coat. The land beyond the town rose in long red shelves toward the ridge, cut through with the deep, bruised shadows of ravines she had ridden as a child. Somewhere out there, past the second bend of the wash, her father had once shown her a pictograph on a rock face, a running horse painted by hands that had left the country 1,000 years before their own. He had said, "You do not own a place like this. It only lets you stay." Laura had been 8. She had not understood him. She understood him now. Supper was mutton stew and cornbread and a tin cup of buttermilk gone slightly sour, and Laura ate all of it because she had not eaten since dawn. There were 3 other lodgers at the long plank table, a drummer selling patent tonics whose sample case rattled every time he shifted his boots, a young Methodist circuit rider with a face like a boy's and hands like a farmer's, and an old man with a white mustache who did not give his name and did not lift his eyes from his plate. The drummer tried twice to make conversation. The circuit rider replied politely. The old man did not reply at all. Laura ate in silence and listened. "You come far, miss?" the drummer asked her at last, when the silence had thickened around him past bearing. "Far enough," Laura said. "Family in town?" "Uncle, north of here." "Merritt Shaw's girl," Hetty said from the kitchen doorway, without looking up from the dishcloth in her hands. The drummer's face brightened with the pleasure of a placed piece, and he opened his mouth to say something else. But the old man at the end of the table set down his spoon, then with a small, deliberate sound, and the drummer closed his mouth again. Laura glanced at the old man. He was looking at her now. His eyes were the pale, washed blue of a sky that has forgotten how to rain, and there was something in them that was not curiosity, and was not welcome, and was not quite pity either. He held her gaze a long moment. Then he went back to his stew. After supper, Laura walked out to the porch and stood in the last of the light. The sun was going down behind the ridge in long copper bands, and the air had begun to cool the way it cooled here, quickly and completely, as though the day had never quite believed in itself. She heard the door open behind her and did not turn. Boots crossed the boards. The old man came to stand at the far end of the porch rail with his hands folded on the wood and his hat pushed back on his head. For a long time he did not speak. Laura did not press him. She had grown up among men who used silence the way other men used words, and she knew the shape of a thing being decided. "You favor your mother," the old man said finally. His voice was thin and dry, like paper left too long in the sun. "I've been told," Laura said. "She was a good woman." "Yes." He nodded once, slowly, and looked out toward the canyons where the last light was leaving the rim rock. "You headed up to Merritt's tomorrow?" "At first light. You'll ride the wash road." "I know the wash road." He was quiet again. A moth had come to the lantern above the door, and its shadow beat against the boards between them. "There's a bend past the second wash," the old man said, "where the rocks lean in and the willows grow. If you look down from the high side, you'll see a roof." Laura turned her head then and looked at him. He did not look back at her. He kept his eyes on the canyons. "A roof," she said. "A church roof, or what's left of it. Down in the canyon, down in the bottom," Laura frowned. She knew the wash road. She had ridden it with her father 100 times before she was 12, and after that, she had ridden it alone. She had never seen a roof down in the bottom. There was nothing in the bottom but stone and sage and the trickle of water that gave the town its name half the year and lied about itself the other half. I never saw it, she said. No, the old man said. Most don't. You have to know where to stand. He paused. And most who knew have gone. The moth beat against the lantern glass. Somewhere in the town a dog began to bark and was answered by another, and then a third, until the barking had traveled the length of the street and come back again and stopped. Why is a church down there? Laura asked. The old man was quiet a long while. When he spoke again, his voice had gone even thinner, and it seemed to Laura that he was not speaking to her exactly, but past her, the way a man will speak past a listener toward a thing he is trying to see for himself. Some houses are built where roads reach, he said. And some are built where no road was ever meant to. A place like that keeps what put it there. He turned his head then and looked at her at last, and his pale eyes had gathered what was left of the light. Don't go down, girl. Ride past it. Look if you have to. But don't go down. Laura opened her mouth to ask him what he meant, but he had already touched the brim of his hat with one knuckle and turned and gone back inside, and the door had closed behind him with a small, dry click, and the moth was still beating at the lantern glass, and the canyons had gone entirely dark. She stood on the porch a long time after that. The night wind came up out of the washes and smelled of sage and cold stone, and something older beneath both, something mineral and slow. She thought of her father on the pommel of his saddle telling her the country only let you stay. She thought of the auctioneer's hammer coming down on the Shaw place. She thought of the whisper that had brushed her spine outside the millinery, and she thought of a roof down in a canyon bottom where no road went. When at last she went inside and climbed the stairs to the small clean room that smelled of lavender water and old wood, she did not undress at once. She stood at the window and looked out at the black shape of the ridge against the paler black of the sky, and she felt the pull of the country, the way a fish feels the pull of a hook it has not yet noticed swallowing. Somewhere out there, past the second bend of the wash, in a fold of stone the light did not reach, a building was waiting that no wagon could have brought. She did not know yet what it was. She did not know yet why the old man's warning had settled into her chest, like a stone dropped into still water. But she knew, standing at that window with her mother's locket cold at her throat, and her father's carbine wrapped in oilcloth on the chair behind her, that she was going to look. That was what her father had raised her to do. Look, even when the country did not want you to. She turned from the window at last and blew out the lamp, and the dark came into the room all at once, complete and patient, the way the dark comes in a place that has been waiting a long time for someone to arrive. She slept in her clothes and woke before the light. The room was cold. She could hear Hetty moving in the kitchen below, the small, dry sounds of a woman who had been rising before dawn for 40 years, the strike of a match, the shift of a kettle onto iron. Laura sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pulled her boots on and laced them slowly. And while she laced them, she watched the window fill with the first thin gray that comes before the sun clears the ridge. She had not dreamed. Or if she had dreamed, she did not remember it. Which was better. She stood and lifted the oilcloth bundle from the chair and unwrapped the carbine and checked it, as her father had shown her when she was 9 years old, breech and hammer and stock. And then she wrapped it again and set it aside. She washed her face at the basin. She braided her hair and pinned it up under her hat. She looked once at herself in the small square of mirror above the washstand and saw a young woman with a straight mouth and eyes the color of riverstone and a face that had lost weight since spring, and she looked away. Downstairs, Hetty had set out coffee and biscuits and a plate of cold bacon and a jar of pear preserves that had gone dark at the edges. The drummer and the circuit rider were not yet down. The old man with the pale, washed blue eyes was not at the table either. Laura sat and ate quickly and drank the coffee scalding, and Hetty stood at the stove with her back turned and did not speak until Laura pushed her chair back. "You are going to your uncle's," Hetty said. "Yes. Take the wash road." "I know it." Hetty turned. Her face was the color of tallow in the lamp. "There is talk in this town that is not for a young woman riding alone. Keep to the road, Laura. Do not stop for anyone you do not know by name." "I will not stop." Hetty looked at her a long moment, and then reached under her apron and brought out a small cloth-wrapped bundle and set it on the table. "Bread, cheese, a twist of salt. Your uncle keeps a lean pantry." Laura took the bundle and thanked her, and Hetty nodded once and turned back to the stove. Laura stood in the doorway with her saddlebags over her shoulder and looked at the older woman's back, at the gray bun pinned tight, and the shoulders set against something that had nothing to do with the morning. And she wanted for a moment to ask her about the roof in the canyon bottom, about the old man, about the whisper on the millinery porch. But she did not. Some questions you carried with you until the country answered them itself. The livery boy had the mare saddled when Laura came down the boardwalk. He was maybe 15, all elbows and a cowlick, and he watched her tie the oilcloth bundle behind the cantle with the careful eyes of a boy who wanted to be a man and knew he was not yet. The mare was a sorrel of no particular breeding, 7 years old, sound in the legs, patient in the mouth. Her name was Juno, and she had carried Laura down from the pass without complaint. Laura ran a hand along her neck, and Juno turned one ear back and blew softly and stood. "Miss," the boy said. Laura looked at him. "That old man, at the boarding house. He rode out before first light." "Which way?" "North, toward the wash." Laura settled her hat. "Thank you." "Miss," the boy said again, and then he did not seem to know what he had meant to say, and he only shook his head and stepped back and let her mount. Laura swung up and settled the reins and touched Juno with her heel, and they went out of the livery yard at a walk, north through the sleeping town, past the sagging false fronts and the boardwalks empty of anything but dust, past the dog with the amber eyes who had come out from beneath the boardwalk and stood in the middle of the street watching her go. Laura looked back once at the dog. The dog did not move. Then the town was behind her and the country opened out. The wash road was not truly a road. It was a wagon trace that followed the bed of an old creek, dry 9 months of the year, that came down out of the canyon country and emptied into the flats below Dry Creek. There were tracks in it, from cattle and from horses, and here and there the older ruts of iron-tired wagons cut deep into the caliche. Laura let Juno walk. The sun came up over the ridge behind her, and threw her shadow long and thin ahead of her across the pale ground. And the shadow of the horse and the shadow of the rider went together up the wash between the cut banks, and the country began to close in. She had ridden this wash 100 times. She had ridden it with her father when she was small enough to sit in front of him on the pommel, and old enough to sit her own pony, and old enough to ride alone. She knew where the willows grew at the first bend, and where the little seep came out of the north wall, and where the antelope crossed. She knew where her father had shot a mule deer in the fall of her 12th year, and where they had dressed it out, and how the blood had darkened the dust. She knew the country. That was what she told herself. She knew the country. But the old man's words rode with her. Most people did not see it. One had to know where to stand. Most who knew had gone. She came to the first wash at mid-morning. The willows there were yellow already, the leaves thin and dry, and the sound of the wind through them was the same small, dry rustle it had always been. Laura stopped Juno and drank from her canteen and looked up at the cutbanks on either side. The stone was red and orange and streaked with the dark stain of old water. There were swallows' nests in the overhangs. Nothing moved but the willows and the wind. She rode on. The wash climbed. The walls grew higher. By noon she was in the deep country, in the folds where the sun reached only for a few hours each day and the shadow stayed cool even in August. She stopped at a wide place where a shelf of rock made a natural table, and she got down and loosened Juno's girth and let her blow. And she ate a piece of Hetty's bread and a piece of Hetty's cheese and drank again from the canteen. Juno cropped at the sparse yellow grass. Laura sat on the shelf of rock and looked back the way she had come, and the wash unwound below her like a length of pale ribbon dropped and forgotten, and there was no one on it. She thought about the old man. She thought about his eyes, pale and washed and unafraid, and about the way he had set his spoon down when Hetty had named her Merritt Shaw's girl. She thought about the way he had chosen his words on the porch, careful, as though each one had a weight he had already measured. "Don't go down, girl. Ride past it. Look if you have to. But don't go down." She thought about her father. Her father had never told her not to look at a thing. Her father had told her the country only let you stay. Her father had told her once, when they were riding this same wash, and she had been perhaps 10 years old, and had asked him why some places felt heavy and some did not, that the country remembered. That was all he had said. The country remembered. She had not understood him then. She was not sure she understood him now. But she understood that a place could hold what had been done in it, the way a jar holds what has been poured in, and that some jars were sealed and some were not, and that a person walking into a canyon with a sealed jar in it had better step carefully. She tightened the girth and mounted again and rode on. The second bend came in the middle of the afternoon. She knew it before she saw it. The stone leaned in from both sides, and the willows grew thick along the bottom, where a seep must run beneath the surface even in the driest months, and the light changed, went blue at the edges, went thin. Laura reined Juno up and sat a long moment listening. There was no sound but the wind, no bird, no insect, no small dry stir of a lizard on stone. The wash bent to the left ahead of her and rose steeply toward the high country. And to her right, the ground fell away in a series of ledges into a canyon she had never once looked down into, though she had ridden past its lip 100 times. She dismounted. She led Juno to a scrub cedar and tied her loosely and loosened the girth again. She unwrapped the carbine from the oilcloth and levered around into the chamber and let the hammer down carefully and slung the rifle over her shoulder on its worn leather strap. Then she walked to the edge. The old man had said one had to know where to stand. Laura understood him at once. The canyon below did not present itself to a rider on the trail. The rider passed above it without ever looking, because the eye followed the wash, and the wash bent left. And the country to the right was only a broken shelf that no horse could descend, and no wagon had ever meant to. She had to step 10 paces off the trail, out onto a nose of rock she had never had reason to walk out onto, before the fold in the ground below opened and showed her what it held. And then she saw the roof. It was not much at first. A darker shape among the darker shapes. A straight line where the country made no straight lines. The pitch of an eave against the sloping wall of the far side. Laura stood on the nose of rock and shaded her eyes with her hand and looked. And the shape resolved slowly. The way a thing resolves when the eye finally accepts what it is being shown. A gable, a ridgepole, the dark hollow of an open door, and rising from the peak of the roof, canted a little to one side, thinner than she had first taken it for, a cross of weathered wood. A church, down there, in the fold of stone at the bottom of a canyon, where no wagon road had ever come, where no proper trail led, where the sun reached for perhaps 3 hours of the day in summer and not at all in winter. A church stood. Its walls were dark with age. Its roof sagged at the ridge. Its yard, what she could see of the yard, was a scatter of pale stones set in rough rows among the sage. Laura's hand went to the locket at her throat and closed around it. She stood there a long time. The wind moved in the willows below her, and the shadow of a hawk crossed the far wall, and the light shifted 1/4 of an inch across the face of the stone. Nothing else moved. She thought for a moment that she could hear something, a small sound rising up the canyon on the air, and she strained after it. And then it was gone, and she was not sure she had heard it at all. The country was quiet. The country was watching. The old man had told her not to go down. The old man had told her to look and ride on. Laura stood on the nose of rock with her father's carbine on her shoulder and her mother's locket in her fist, and she looked down at a church no one had told her existed in the country she had known all her life, and she felt the ground under her boots and the weight of the rifle and the small, hard cold of the silver against her palm, and she knew, with the same certainty with which she had known she was going to look, that she was going to go down. What would you do, standing where she stood? Would you turn Juneau back toward Dry Creek and ride the washout and pretend you had never seen a roof where no roof should be? Or would you find the way down that some hand, long ago, had surely left? If this story is finding you tonight, stay with her. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and follow along, because the way Laura found down into that canyon was older than the church itself, and what it led her to was older still. She did not go down that day. Later, when she tried to explain to herself why she had not, she would think of the light. The sun had already tipped past the western rim, and the canyon below the nose of rock had begun to fill with the long blue shadow that comes early in a deep place. She had 8, perhaps 9 hours of ride still ahead of her before her uncle's holding, and she had not told Merritt what day she was coming, and a canyon at dusk is a canyon that keeps you. She would think of that. She would also think, honestly, of the old man's voice on the porch, low and formal and almost tender. "Don't go down, girl. Ride past it. Look if you have to. But don't go down." She looked. She looked until the light shifted another 1/4 of an inch, and the cross on the roof peak went from copper to bronze to iron. She looked until Juneau, tied to the scrub cedar behind her, blew softly once through her nose, the way the mare did when she was ready to be moving. Then Laura stepped back from the edge, slow, the way a person steps back from the lip of a well, and walked to the mare and put her hand on Juneau's shoulder for a moment, before she tightened the girth. She unloaded the carbine, lowered the hammer twice to be sure, wrapped the rifle again in its oilcloth, and tied the bundle behind the cantle. She mounted. She turned Juneau's head to the trail. She did not look back at the nose of rock. She rode. The wash climbed hard through the afternoon. The walls opened and closed, and opened again. She passed a place where a spring had once run, and left a stain the color of old iron down the pale stone. She passed a place where someone, in some year long before her own, had piled 3 flat rocks one atop the other, in a cairn no taller than her knee, and she wondered as she rode past it whether the cairn had been raised as a marker for a trail or a warning against one. She did not stop to look. By the time the sun found her again over the high edge of the canyon country, she was up on the bench above the wash, in country of scattered pinyon and juniper and pale grass, and she could see, far ahead across a long flat, the dark line of cottonwoods that meant water and, past them, the low, soddy outbuildings of her uncle's place. She reached it near sundown. Merritt Shaw came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, and stood for a long moment looking at her, and then he set down the rag and lifted her out of the saddle as though she were still a child, and held her for the space of 3 breaths without saying anything. He was smaller than she remembered. His hair had gone white at the temples in the 3 seasons since she had seen him. He smelled of hay and horse and the good clean smoke of a pinyon fire. He did not ask her about her father. He fed her a supper of beans and salt pork and coffee, and he asked her about the ride down, and he asked her about the pass, and he asked her about Juno's feet, and he did not ask her about her father. When she had eaten, he showed her the small room at the back of the cabin, with its narrow bed and its single window looking east toward the canyon country she had ridden out of, and he told her the room was hers as long as she wanted it, and he said good night and closed the door. Laura sat on the edge of the bed a long time in the dark before she lay down. She did not sleep well. Twice she woke thinking she had heard the small sound she thought she had heard on the nose of rock, and twice she lay listening and heard only the wind under the eaves and the settling of the cabin timbers, and once the far low cry of a coyote on the ridge. Toward morning she slept. She stayed at Merritt's for the better part of a week before she rode back to town. There was work enough at the holding to fill a woman's days 3 times over: a fence line to walk, a well pump that stuck when the wind was north, a mare due to foal in the small pasture behind the barn. Laura did the work without being asked. Merritt watched her the way a man watches something he is glad to have and afraid to say so, and let her be. On the 4th night, at the kitchen table with a lamp between them, he said her father's name aloud for the first time, and Laura said, "I know," and neither of them said anything else. And that was the beginning and the end of the morning they would do together in words. On the 6th day, she told Merritt she needed to ride to Dry Creek for thread and a can of coal oil and a letter she was expecting at the post. Merritt looked at her once and looked at the doorway to the canyon country and said only, "Take the carbine." She said she would. She rode in on a Tuesday. The town was fuller than it had been the week before, on account of it being a hauling day, and there were 3 wagons drawn up outside the mercantile and a knot of men standing at the corner of the boardwalk under the sign of the assay office. Laura tied Juno at the rail and went into the mercantile and bought her thread and her can of oil and asked at the counter for her letter, and there was none. She stood a moment on the boardwalk outside with the small paper parcel under her arm and looked at the town in the noon light. The 2 women were on the millinery porch again. The tall, pinched one in the gray shawl was the same. The other was shorter, red-faced, with a bonnet drawn tight under her chin. When Laura came out of the mercantile, the shorter one glanced up and then quickly down again, and the pinched one did not look away at all, and Laura heard, as she stepped down off the boardwalk, the shorter one say something low, and the pinched one answer low also, and both of them let the words fall in that particular way of a whisper that is meant to be half heard. She caught Merritt Shaw's girl. She caught back down there. She caught, or thought she caught, her father's business. Laura walked past the porch without turning her head. She untied Juno. She did not mount at once. She stood with her hand on the mare's neck, feeling the good warm smell of her, and let her breath come slow. Reputation is a currency you cannot spend but only carry, her father had once told her. What people say of you, you can neither pay nor refuse. You can only keep walking and hope the ledger balances at the end. She was leading Juno down the street toward the livery, when the knot of men at the corner of the boardwalk parted a little to let one of their number step down into the dust. He was a tall man in a black frock coat, cut too fine for the town, with cufflinks and a gold watch chain across a good waistcoat, and a face that had once been handsome and had gone flat and hard in the way that faces do when a man has spent a long time deciding he is worth more than the country he stands in. Laura knew him at once. He had been the man on the courthouse steps. He had been the man who had bought the Shaw place. His name was Prewitt Hale. He tipped his hat to her with an exaggerated courtesy that was not courtesy at all, and he said, loud enough for the boardwalk to hear, "Miss Shaw, I was sorry to hear about your father." Laura did not answer. "Sorry twice," he said. "Once for the man and once for the place. It was a good little cabin. Wanted paint, but a good cabin." Laura kept walking. Juno's shoulder was at her elbow. "They tell me you're staying up at your uncle's now," Prewitt said. He was matching her pace, unhurried, along the edge of the boardwalk, his boots hitting the plank a half beat after her boots hit the dust. "Merritt runs a lean outfit. Hard grass up there. Coldwell." "He does well enough," Laura said. "Well enough," Prewitt said, and smiled. "That's a Shaw answer if I ever heard one. Your father said well enough to me the last time I stood on his porch, 2 months before the note came due." Laura stopped. She did not turn. She said quietly, "Good day, Mr. Hale." "Good day, Miss Shaw," he said. He did not stop walking. He passed her, and his shadow went ahead of him along the boardwalk. And at the corner where the men were standing, he turned and said, still loud enough for her to hear, "Some folks are made to hold a place. Some folks are made to lose one. It ain't cruel to say so. It's the country talking." The men on the corner laughed. Not all of them. 2 of them did not. And one of those 2 turned his face away, as though he were interested in something down the street. But enough of them laughed that the sound carried. Laura felt it strike the back of her neck. She did not turn. She led Juno the rest of the way to the livery, and the livery boy, the same boy of maybe 15, took the mare's reins without meeting her eye, and Laura saw that he had heard the laugh too, and that he was ashamed for her, and she was, in a small, tired way, grateful to him for the shame. She would have gone straight back to Merritt's. She had meant to. But there was a bench outside the boarding house across from the livery, in the shade of the sagging awning, and when she came out of the barn with her parcel, her legs went to it without her deciding, and she sat, and she set the parcel on her knee, and she let her breath out slow. She had not been sitting a full minute before the door of the boarding house opened behind her, and the old man came out onto the porch. He was dressed exactly as he had been the week before. Worn dark coat, colorless shirt buttoned to the throat, a hat that had been good once and was not now. His pale, washed blue eyes went over her once, and past her, and up the street toward the corner where Prewitt Hale had been, and back. He did not sit. He came and stood at the porch post nearest the bench, and put one hand on the post, as if to hold himself there. "I heard him," the old man said. Laura did not answer. "There is a kind of man," the old man said, "who buys a thing and thinks the buying makes him bigger than the thing. He will find out. He will find out slow, or he will find out fast. But he will find out." Laura looked at the boards of the porch. "It was my father's place," she said. "I know whose place it was." She turned her face up to him then. He was looking down the street, not at her. In the noon light, his eyes were nearly white. "You went to the second bend," he said. Laura did not ask him how he knew. She said, "I looked. I did not go down." "No," the old man said. You did not. Not yet. There was a silence between them that had town noise in it, wagon and voice and the far ring of a hammer at the smithy, and none of it touched them. I am going to go down, Laura said. She had not known she was going to say it. She said it anyway. The old man was quiet a long time. Then he said, in that spare, formal voice she had heard on the porch of the boarding house the week before, the voice that sounded as if it belonged to a language older than the one he was speaking, "Girl. A road that is gone is not the same as a road that was never there. When you find the way down, look at the ground you walk on. Someone walked it before you, and someone made sure you would not know they had." He took his hand off the porch post. He touched the brim of his hat to her, not with the mockery Prewitt Hale had used, but with something closer to the way a man salutes a grave. He went back into the boarding house and shut the door behind him. Laura sat a long time on the bench with the parcel on her knee, and the old man's words turning in her head like a stone turned in a hand. A road that is gone is not the same as a road that was never there. She did not understand him. She understood only that he had told her, without telling her, that there had been a way down once, and that the way down had not disappeared of itself. Overhead, the awning creaked in a small hot wind. Down the street, at the corner, Prewitt Hale's laugh went up again at some new thing, and the men around him laughed with him, and the sound went into the dust of the street and did not carry as far as it had before. Laura rose. She untied Juno. She rode out of Dry Creek at the walk, past the millinery porch where the two women had gone back inside, past the mercantile, past the assay office with its faded false front, past the dog with amber eyes lying now in a square of shade beneath the boardwalk with its chin on its paws. The dog watched her go. At the edge of town, she touched Juno's flank with her heel, and the mare moved into a slow trot, and Laura took the wash road north, and the country closed in around her, and somewhere ahead of her, invisible from where she rode but no less certainly there, was a roof no wagon had brought, and a road someone had made sure she would not know had ever been. She rode with the parcel of thread and coal oil tied down behind her cantle beside the oilcloth bundle, and she rode as if she carried nothing in the world but that. The wash road climbed slow out of the flats. Juno moved with her ears loose, going the way a horse goes when it has walked a road often enough to think of nothing while walking it. Laura sat straight in the saddle and watched the country come toward her the way it had come toward her 100 times before. The sagebrush was silvered under the afternoon light. Grasshoppers rose out of the dry grass at Juno's feet and hung and dropped again. A red-tailed hawk turned above the ridge and did not turn again. She had not gone half a mile out of Dry Creek before she understood she was not riding to Merritt's. Merritt would be at the barn or at the pump, or bent over the mare in the small pasture, and Merritt would look up when he heard Juno on the gravel and go back to his work without saying a word about her being back later than she had meant to be. Merritt would not ask. That was the shape of the country and the shape of him inside it. He would not ask, and she would not tell him, and by first light she would be gone again with the carbine and a bit of Hetty's bread, if there was bread, and with Juno's girth freshly checked, and Merritt would find the note she left on the kitchen table under the tin cup, and would read it once, and set the cup back down on top of it. She thought of that note as she rode. She had not written it yet. She was writing it in her head. Gone up the wash a day or two. Do not come after me. There is a thing I mean to see. She would sign it with her name and nothing else. Merritt would not come after her. Merritt would sit at the table with the note under the cup and drink his coffee, and he would look toward the canyon country, the way he had looked toward it the night before. She rode in with the parcel on her knee, and he would let her be, because that was the only thing he had ever known to give anyone he loved. The sun was still an hour high when she reached the first bend. The willows there had gone another shade toward yellow in the days since she had passed them. She let Juno drink at the seep, though the seep was hardly wet, and the mare's lip only found the damp stone. Laura got down and drank from her canteen. She listened to the wash. There was more sound in the country now than there had been a week ago at the same hour, or perhaps she heard more because she was listening harder. A raven called from the north wall. A lizard scraped away between two flat rocks. The wind moved in the willows and made the sound of paper being pulled slowly through a hand. She thought of the old man's face on the porch post, with his eyes pale and washed. She thought of the way he had touched the brim of his hat to her before he had gone inside. He had touched it as a man touches his hat to a grave. She had seen a man do that once, in the little cemetery outside Willow Bend, standing over her father's fresh mound with his hands crossed at his belt. That man had been no kin, no friend she knew, only a rider who had come in off the north road and stood a moment and touched his hat and mounted again and gone. Her father had said in his lifetime that a stranger's respect is the only respect worth having, because a stranger owes you nothing. Laura pulled the canteen back from her mouth and stoppered it. She thought that she was going to ride into a country where the strangers would not be able to speak to her, being dead, and where their respect, if it was there, would have to be read off the ground. She rode on. The wash climbed. The walls closed. By the time the sun had gone off the east wall entirely, and only the top of the west wall still burned copper above her, she had come again to the second bend, and again she reined Juno up short of it, and again she listened. This time she listened not to hear whether anyone was near, but to hear what the place itself had to say to her when she came to it in the last hour of the day. It said nothing. The willows there were quiet. The scrub cedar where she had tied Juno the week before still stood where she remembered it, and she rode to it and dismounted and tied the mare to it a second time. The same knot, in the same bark-worn place, as if this were a thing done many times already, and not the second time only. She did not walk to the nose of rock first. She unsaddled Juno instead. She lifted the saddle down off the mare's back and set it on end against the cedar with the blanket folded on top of it. And she loosened the halter and let Juno crop what dry grass there was between the stones. She untied the oilcloth bundle and unwrapped the carbine and levered around into the chamber and lowered the hammer. She did all this without hurry. She took her father's small tin of matches out of the saddlebag and put them in the pocket of her coat. She took Hetty's cloth from a week ago, laundered now and refolded, containing a heel of bread and a piece of yellow cheese and the last twist of salt, and she put that into the coat's other pocket. She took the canteen off the horn and slung it over her shoulder. Then she walked to the nose of rock. The light was not the light of a week ago. A week ago the sun had still been high enough to sit on the far wall and pour into the fold of stone and touch the roof of the church and make the cross at the peak copper. Now the sun was gone from the fold. The canyon under her was already blue with the beginning of dusk, and the roof, when she found it, was not a copper thing, but a thing the color of ash under water. The gable was there. The ridgepole was there. The dark hollow of the open door was there. The cross at the roof peak was canted the same way it had been canted, and it did not catch the light because there was no light left for it to catch. She stood with her father's carbine on her shoulder and her mother's silver locket in her fist as she had stood the week before. And she looked down, and she felt the country hold its breath around her. She had said in Dry Creek, sitting on the bench with the parcel on her knee, that she was going to go down. She had said it out loud to the old man, and she had said it in her head all the way up the wash. She had meant, in Dry Creek, to go down that same afternoon before the sun set, and to walk the yard and put her hand on the door and read whatever there was to be read, and to be up out of the canyon before dark. She saw now that she had told herself a lie. There was not time. There had never been time. She had been meant to come here at dusk, to look and to stay. She sat down on the nose of rock. She laid the carbine across her knees. She uncorked the canteen and drank a mouthful and stoppered it again. She watched the light drain out of the canyon by inches. The blue of the shadow rose along the walls, until the last copper on the west rim was a thin edge that could be covered with a fingernail held at arm's length. She held her hand up and covered it and lowered her hand, and the edge was gone. Below her, the roof of the church went from ash to slate, to a shape darker than the sage around it, and then only a shape, and then a shape the eye had to know was there in order to see. She did not go down. She had said she would, and she did not. And she understood as she sat there that she was not disobeying herself. She was waiting. There is a way to come to a thing, and there is a way not to come to it. The way not to come to it is to arrive at the end of a hard day with the light gone and no plan, and only a rifle across your knees and a heart beating a little too high in your chest. The way to come to it is at first light, rested, with your hands steady, and with the sun rising into the fold at your back, so that when you set your foot on the ground of the yard, you can see what is under your boot. Her father had taught her this without ever putting it into words. He had taught her by taking her, when she was small, to no place fast, and by making her sit down before he showed her a thing. She built no fire. A fire on the nose of rock would have been seen from the wash road, and possibly from the high country beyond. And though she could not think who would be looking, she thought of the old man's face and the way he had said someone had made sure she would not know. Someone. Not any one man in particular, or perhaps a particular man once and now other men in his place, or perhaps only the memory of that first man carried in the mouths of men who had never been down. She did not know. She did not need to know tonight. Tonight she needed only to sit on the rock and to eat her bread and cheese and to keep the carbine dry across her knees and to watch the shape of the roof become a shape she carried behind her eyes when she closed them. She ate slow. The bread had gone hard at the edges and the cheese sweated a little in the wrapping, but the salt was fresh and clean on her tongue. She thought of Hetty in the kitchen at the boarding house, of the rows of tin cups on the shelf above the stove, of the smell of lavender water in the linen. She thought of the drummer's rattling case, the circuit rider's boyish face, the old man's washed blue eyes. She thought of Prewitt Hale's laugh at the corner, and how it had not carried today as it had carried a week ago. She thought of the two men on the corner who had not laughed, the one who had turned his face away, and of what it meant that a man could turn his face away and not stand up and speak and yet still count for something in the ledger of a place. It counted for something. It was not enough. It was not nothing. Full dark came. It came the way it comes in canyon country, not by inches now, but at once, as if the last blue of the sky had been a lid drawn across a well. The stars came into the strip of sky above her one at a time, and then in handfuls. She could not see the church anymore. She could see the general dark bulk of the far wall of the canyon, and she could hear, once, a small dry rattle far below, that might have been a stone falling on stone of its own weight, or that might have been the small foot of some living thing. She did not put her hand to the carbine. She let the sound go past her and be gone. She went back to Juno at last. She spread her father's oilcloth on the ground under the cedar with the saddle for a pillow and the saddle blanket for a cover, and she lay down. Juno stood over her a moment, blew warm breath into her hair, and then moved off to the length of her tie and cropped again at the dry grass. Laura lay on her back and looked up at what stars she could see through the branches. She had not been afraid in the daylight, and she was not afraid now, but she felt small in a way she had not felt small in a long time. She felt small the way she had felt small at 8 years old, when her father had lifted her down off the pommel outside the feed store and set her on her own feet on the boardwalk and gone into the store without her, and she had stood there in her own shadow and understood for the first time that she was going to have to walk into every room of her life alone. She slept in pieces. Once she woke and did not know where she was, and put her hand out and touched the stock of the carbine and knew. Once she woke because Juno had shifted her weight from one hip to the other, and the shift had moved a small stone under the mare's hoof. Once she woke because a coyote called on the ridge above her, and another answered from the wash below, and the two voices threaded across the dark for a moment, and then went silent. And she lay listening for a third, and there was no third. Once she woke and heard, or thought she heard, from somewhere below her in the canyon, a small sound that was not the sound of stone or wind or any living thing she could name. It was the sound of a hinge. It was the sound a door makes when a slow wind pushes it a hand's breadth and lets it settle again. She lay still for a long time with her eyes open in the dark. She did not hear it again. She told herself she had not heard it the first time. She did not believe herself. She waited for the gray in the east. The gray came slower than she had expected, or perhaps she had been waiting harder than she knew. It arrived first as an absence, the thinning of black at the notch where the canyon opened to the east, and then as a pale wash, the color of skimmed milk laid over the far rim. Laura sat up under the cedar with the saddle blanket falling from her shoulders and her hand already on the carbine. Juno was still where she had left her, head low, one hind foot cocked, ears turned toward the lower wash. The mare had heard nothing new, or nothing she considered worth turning her head for. Laura took that as she had learned to take such things, not as proof, but as counsel. She did not eat. She drank a swallow from the canteen and rinsed her mouth and spat into the dirt behind the cedar so that no one who came upon the place later would find a wet mark on stone. She rolled the oilcloth and tied it. She saddled Juno slowly, checking each strap the way her father had checked them when she was small, running a finger under the girth to feel for a wrinkle, laying her palm flat on the mare's shoulder for a moment before she tightened the last buckle. Juno stood for her. Juno had always stood for her. She did not mount. She looped Juno's reins loosely around a low limb of the cedar and left her there with the halter under the bridle, in case Laura needed to strip the bridle off in a hurry and leave the mare on the halter alone. She took the carbine from where it had lain across her knees in the night, checked the chamber without looking, felt the round seated, felt the hammer at half cock, and slung the rifle on its worn leather strap across her back, so her hands would be free for stone. Her mother's silver locket she did not touch. It was where it had been. It would be where it was. Then she walked, not to the nose of rock this time, but past it, along the lip of the canyon in the direction the wash road did not go. She had promised herself the night before that she would go down at first light. She meant to keep the promise, but she meant also to keep it well. And to keep it well, she had to find a way down, and she did not yet know where the way down was. The old man's voice went with her along the lip. A road that is gone is not the same as a road that was never there. When you find the way down, Look at the ground you walk on. She walked with the light coming up behind her, and the canyon still holding its blue. She walked slowly, watching her boots, watching the stone. She had ridden past this lip 100 times without seeing the roof below it. She was prepared now to walk it 100 paces without seeing what her boots were on. The first thing that refused to fit was a juniper. It stood 20 paces past the nose of rock, on the canyon side of a low hummock, and it was the wrong shape. Juniper on the rim country grew the way juniper grew, crooked, hunched, twisted by wind into shapes that leaned away from the prevailing weather. This one leaned the wrong way. Its trunk was bent toward the wind, not from it, as if something had pressed it over from the uphill side when it was young, and it had grown around the pressing and kept the shape after the thing was gone. Laura stopped and looked at it. She put her hand on the trunk. The bark was old. The bend was old. She stepped past the juniper and looked at the ground on its uphill side, and there, faint under the crust of caliche and a scurf of dry needles, was a swale, a dip, a place where the ground had once been lower than it was now and had filled back in unevenly, the way ground fills in over a track that was cut and then abandoned. She followed the swale with her eyes. It ran along the lip for perhaps 40 feet, curving gently, and then it was gone under a slide of pale rubble that had come off the rim above. Beyond the rubble, the ground looked ordinary. She walked to the rubble and stood on the near edge of it and looked at the far edge. And after a long moment, she saw the swale resume 30 feet on, at the same grade, curving the same curve, and disappearing again around the shoulder of the ridge. The rubble had not fallen, or it had fallen, but it had been helped. She could not have said in that moment how she knew. Something in the way the stones lay. Too even in their tumble, no fine gravel worked down into the spaces the way rain and time work gravel down. The stones sat on the surface. They had been carried and set one at a time, by hands that meant them to look as if they had come off the rim on their own. She knelt. She did not touch them. She looked at the underside of the nearest stone, at the line where it met the earth, and she saw that the earth beneath it was pale and dry and undisturbed, as if the stone had been laid there yesterday, and again the year before, and again 10 years before that, each time a little differently, so that the ground beneath had never learned the weight. Laura sat back on her heels. She thought, without wanting to, of her father putting a stone on a coyote den mouth to make the den look empty. He had shown her how, when she was 11. You set the stone as if it had rolled. You do not press it in. You leave a little air under one edge. Anyone who does not know will pass it. Anyone who knows will see it in a heartbeat. She stood up and stepped back from the rubble, and she did not clear it, and she did not walk on it, and she went on along the lip past it, walking now with a different attention. The way a person walks who has understood that everything on the ground she is looking at may be a lie. She found the second lie 30 paces on, a cedar stump cut clean at knee height, the cut face weathered gray but not soft, and the stump set into the ground at a place where no cedar would have grown, on bare stone with only a handful of dirt in a crack. The stump had been carried there. It had been set up as a marker, or perhaps as an anchor for a rope, and the cut had been made by an axe, not saw, the mark of a single-bit axe, 4 inches across, taken at one clean angle by a man who knew his work. She did not touch the stump. She walked past it and looked back at it from 10 paces on, and from that angle she saw what it marked. The swale resumed on the far side of the stump. The stump stood at the outer edge of a curve that a wagon would have needed to take. Coming down off the lip, if a wagon had ever come this way. She turned her head slowly and traced the curve with her eyes, back the way she had come. The rubble slide was the inside of the same curve. The bent juniper was the top of the same curve. She was standing on the ghost of a road. She stood still for a long time. The light was coming up harder now, sliding down the west wall of the canyon, and the shadow at the bottom was beginning to gray. She could not yet see the church from where she stood. The lip curved out and hid it. But she knew where it was, in the fold below her, and she knew now that a road had once come down off this rim, curving past the juniper and the stump, and continuing down the slope she had not yet seen, and that somebody had spent a long time and a great deal of labor making the road disappear. She went on. Past the stump, the lip fell away in a series of low benches, each one dropping 4 or 5 feet to the next. And on the third bench, she found what the old man had told her, in his roundabout way, to look for. The bench was floored with a pale caliche that took a print easily and held it. There were no prints on it now, but across its surface, running the direction of the vanished road, were 2 parallel bands where the caliche had been laid down again, wetted and troweled and let to dry, and the second laying did not quite match the first. The color was a shade off, the texture was finer. The bands were the width of a wagon's wheels. Someone had taken up the ruts and refilled them. Laura went down onto her heels again and touched the caliche with 2 fingers, and the bands were dry and old under her hand, but they were not as old as the caliche around them. 10 years, she thought. Perhaps 12. Not 30. Not 50. Someone had walked this bench with a bucket and a trowel and a slow patience in the years when she had been a girl on her father's pommel outside the feed store, and had put the ground back the way the ground had not been. She lifted her hand from the caliche and looked at her fingertips. There was a paleness on them. She rubbed it into her thumb. It was the dust of the second laying, finer than the first, ground almost to flour. She wiped her hand on her skirt and stood. At the far edge of the third bench, she found the last thing that refused to fit, and this one she did not need to interpret. Set into the face of the drop between the third bench and the fourth, at just about the height a man's shoulder would reach if he were bracing himself with a hand while easing a wagon down, was an iron ring. It was rusted to the color of dried blood. It was bolted into the stone with a spike driven into a hand-drilled hole and let it in. She had seen such rings in her father's country, at places where wagons had to be belayed down grades too steep to trust. She had seen them on the pass. She had never seen one on a face of stone that was supposed to be empty country. She looked at the ring a long time. She did not touch it. She looked at the face of the stone above it and below it, and she saw, faintly, where a second ring had been, and a third, in a descending line down the face, and where each of those rings had been pried out of the rock, the holes plugged with mortar tinted to match the stone, and the mortar itself weathered now nearly to invisibility. Only the one ring remained. Whoever had pulled the others had left this one, and she could not tell if it had been left by mistake, by exhaustion, or on purpose, so that some later comber with the right eye would know. Laura stepped back from the drop. She stepped back until she stood again on the second bench, and then on the first, and then on the lip, and then in the swale beside the bent juniper. And she looked back along the ghost of the road she had walked, and she saw the whole of it now for what it was, a passage cut and used, and then unmade by hands that had wanted no one to follow. The sun cleared the east rim as she stood there. The light came across the top of her hat and lit the far canyon wall in a slow copper bloom. and somewhere below her in the fold of stone, the roof of the church would be catching it now. The canted cross going from gray to bronze to something warmer. She did not go down to see. She did not go back to the nose of rock. She stood on the ghost road with her father's carbine on her back and her mother's locket at her throat. And she looked at the ground she had walked on, and she understood, in the plain, declarative way a thing is understood when it has stopped being a suspicion and become a fact, that the road had not been lost. The road had been buried, and whoever had buried it had known exactly what they were burying, and had meant the burying to hold. She turned then and walked back to Juno without hurrying. She did not touch the ring on the way past. She did not disturb the caliche or the stump or the rubble or the bent juniper. She left them as she had found them, because the old man had told her, without telling her, that a person who reads a hidden thing had better not announce that she has read it. She reached the cedar. Juno lifted her head. Laura put her hand on the mare's neck and stood there a moment with her forehead against Juno's shoulder, breathing the warm horse smell, and then she untied the reins and led the mare out onto the lip and did not mount. She walked, and Juno walked behind her, and together they went a little way up the wash away from the second bend before Laura found a place she trusted enough to stop and think. And there she stopped, and she did not yet know what she was going to do, only that she was not going down that morning, and not by that road, and not until she had understood a little more of what the road had been made to hide. She stopped in a wide place where 3 cottonwoods stood far up the wash from any water, growing on some deep memory of a spring that no longer surfaced. Their bark was gray and split, their leaves already turning at the tips, and their shade lay in a long, thin strip across the caliche. Laura tied Juno to the middle tree, loose enough that the mare could reach the dry grass, and she sat down on a flat stone with the carbine across her knees and looked back the way she had come. She could not see the second bend from where she sat. That was part of why she had chosen the place. She could see the wash road climbing gently past her and losing itself in the pinyon farther up, and she could see the lip of the canyon dropping away to her right, and above the lip the sky, already blue and hard with morning, no cloud in it, nothing moving but a hawk on a slow spiral 1/2 mile off. The hawk was riding a thermal above country she now knew held a hidden church, a hidden road, and 1 iron ring left where 3 had been. She thought about the ring for a long time. It had been left because it could not easily be pried out, or because whoever unmade the road had not had time to finish, or because leaving one had seemed to them a small enough thing that no one who passed above would ever look closely at the drop between 2 benches 30 feet below the lip. Laura suspected all 3. She suspected also that the leaving of the 1 ring was the kind of small carelessness that betrayed a larger care. A man who plugs 2 ring holes and does not plug. The third is a man who has run out of daylight or has run out of nerve. Either way, a man. She sat still and let herself think plainly. Someone had built a church at the bottom of a canyon. Someone had hauled the timber and the nails and the glass and the bell, if there had been a bell, down a road that had once existed. And after the church stood, someone had come back and taken up the road behind it. Not all at once, perhaps. Perhaps in stages. Perhaps only after the last living person who used the road was gone from the country. But taken up all the same, and taken up carefully, by hands that knew what a wagon needs coming off a lip and what a wagon leaves behind, and how to disguise both. Laura understood then that she was not looking for the story of a place. She was looking for the story of a decision. Someone had decided the church at the canyon bottom must not be reached. Someone had decided that later people, riding the wash road, as she had ridden it since she was a child, must not know a road had ever gone down. Someone had decided the church must be permitted to fall in on itself alone. She thought of Prewitt Hale in his black frock coat at the corner of the boardwalk, and she set the thought aside without letting it settle. She did not yet know that it belonged there. She only knew that the shape of the decision fit hands like his, and that she had promised herself she would not name a man to a crime before the crime had named itself. Laura decided, sitting on that flat stone under the cottonwoods, that she would not go down that day, and she would not go down the next. She would work her way along the lip in both directions from the nose of rock, taking one morning and one evening at a time, and she would read the ground the way the old man had told her to read it, and she would let her hands and her feet tell her what her mind did not yet know. She thought this was the only honest way. If someone had taken pains to hide a road, then that road had been read and understood by people who knew it before it was hidden, and the reading of it now would take patient work, the way any inherited work takes patient work. She rode back to Merritt's holding that afternoon at a walk. She reached the cabin before dusk. Merritt was at the pump. He looked up, saw her, saw the carbine still slung across her back, saw the parcel of thread and coal oil in the saddlebag, and did not ask where she had been for a night and a day. He set down the wrench, took Juno's reins from her, and led the mare toward the barn. Laura went inside, put the parcel on the kitchen table, filled the tin cup from the water bucket, and drank it down. At supper, Merritt said, "You'll be going back up." It was not a question. Laura said, "Yes." Merritt cut a piece of salt pork in half on his tin plate and gave her the larger piece and said, "Take an axe, and a bar, and rope. If you're going to work, work." Laura looked at him. Merritt did not look up from his plate. He said, "You'll tell me when there's a thing to tell." Laura said, "Yes." The next morning she rode out again before first light with a felling axe, a 5-foot pinch bar, 40 feet of hemp rope, a shovel with a shortened handle, and a hammer wrapped in sacking to keep it quiet. She had Hetty's cloth refolded, and a fresh heel of bread from Merritt's own baking, and a piece of hard cheese wrapped in waxed paper. Juno carried it all without complaint. The mare had grown steady in the country, and she moved up the wash at a walk that ate ground. At the second bend, Laura tied Juno again at the scrub cedar in the same bark-worn place, and did not go to the nose of rock. She went instead in the opposite direction, along the lip, west, into country she had not walked before. She carried the pinch bar in one hand, and the shovel in the other, and the axe slung across her back with the carbine. She walked with her eyes on the ground. She found nothing for the first 200 paces. The lip there was rough and broken, unsuited for a wagon by any reading. Then, at a place where the canyon opened into a small side draw feeding the main gorge, she saw the ground change. The lip smoothed, the stone dipped in a shallow saddle. On the far side of the saddle, a low bank of earth had been mounded up by hands and dressed with rubble and dry brush. Laura knelt at the mound. She pushed the pinch bar into it at a slant. The bar met resistance and then went in. She pulled it out and looked at the tip. Fresh, dry earth clung to it, and beneath the earth, on the flat of the bar, a faint, dark stain the color of old iron. She smelled the stain. It smelled of nothing. She scraped a little of the stain onto her thumbnail and rubbed it between finger and thumb. It powdered. It was rust from a nail or a strap iron in the mound. Something metal had been buried in the earth of the bank. She did not dig it out. She replaced the dry brush and the rubble carefully in the disturbed place, patted them flat, and stepped back. She thought of a wagon's brake shoe or a broken axle strap, or the twisted iron of a wheel rim someone had pushed off the lip and covered, rather than carry back up. She thought of what a man does when a wagon breaks on the descent, and he cannot get the pieces out. He buries them where they fell. He puts the earth back over them. She walked on. Past the mound, the lip curved south, and she followed it. 50 paces farther, she found a place where the caliche had been picked at, in a rough oval, and the pick marks refilled with pale mortar tinted to match. She knelt and put her hand flat on the mortared place. It was cool. It was the size and shape of a wagon tire that had cracked and split and been left behind and later buried in place. She left it undisturbed. By noon, she had found 4 such places along a half-mile stretch of the lip, 2 mounds, 1 mortared oval, and 1 dark seam of earth, where something long and thin, perhaps a broken shaft, had been laid in a shallow trench and covered. She sat on a stone in the thin shade of a juniper, and ate a piece of bread and a piece of cheese, and drank water from the canteen, and she thought. The picture was becoming clearer, and it was not a picture she liked. A wagon road down into a canyon takes many crossings. A wagon coming up out of that canyon takes many more. Every crossing risks a break, and every break leaves iron, and iron does not rot. The people who unmade the road had spent time not only on the road itself, but on every place along it where iron had come to rest. They had walked the whole descent and the whole ascent, and they had removed or buried every piece of metal that might, a generation later, tell a rider on the lip that a wagon had once passed there. They had done thorough work, and they had done it while no one was watching. And they had done it with time enough not to hurry. Laura returned to Juneau by mid-afternoon. She untied the mare, mounted, rode east along the wash a mile, and came back down along the lip on the other side of the second bend, the side where the nose of rock stood. This time she walked past the nose of rock without pausing, and continued east. She found on that side, in the first quarter mile, 3 more places. A plugged post hole, where a heavy timber had once been driven for a snubbing post to slow a descending wagon. A low course of stones set at an angle that would only have made sense as the corner of a switchback wall. And, at the base of a large boulder, a wedge-shaped depression in the earth that had been filled with rubble and dust, the exact size and shape of a wagon jack that had been left in place and lost and covered. At the switchback corner, she stopped a long time. She ran her hand along the low course of stones. Someone had built a small wall there to keep a wagon from sliding on the outer curve. Someone had then, later, taken the wall down, keeping only what could not be moved, and had scattered the missing stones down the slope to look like natural fall. Laura could see, if she looked, the scattered stones on the slope, arranged just too regularly to be the work of weather. She could also see, in her mind, the wall as it had stood, 3 feet high, dry-laid, curving with the road. She sat on the low course and put her hands on her knees. Her palms were rough with the day's work, and dark with caliche and mortar dust. Her fingernails were rimmed with the pale flour of the repaired ruts. She rubbed her thumb across her fingertips and felt the grit. Her hands were beginning to learn what her mind was, only just now understanding. She had come down from the pass 3 seasons after leaving Willow Bend, carrying a carbine and a locket, expecting nothing from Dry Creek, but a room and work at her uncle's. She had not expected a canyon with a hidden church, or a hidden road, or the slow, methodical labor of a people who had erased their own work from the country. She had not expected to find herself, at 22, sitting on the last course of a switchback wall built by hands she did not know, hearing in her mind the small dry rattle from below in the dark. She rose, dusted her hands on her skirt, and walked back to Juno at the second bend. The sun was low. She untied the mare, loaded the tools, and rode down the wash toward Merritt's holding without going to the nose of rock. She had seen enough for one day. Her hands had learned enough for one day. At Merritt's that night, at the kitchen table under the lamp, Merritt looked at her palms without asking to see them. He said, "You're finding work up there." Laura said, "Yes." Merritt said, "Whose work?" Laura said, "I don't know yet." Merritt nodded once, as if that were the correct answer, and cut a slice of bread and pushed the butter toward her. Later, in the small back room with the east-facing window, Laura sat on the narrow bed and unpinned her hair. She thought of the mounds, the mortared ovals, the plugged post hole, the switchback wall, and the one iron ring left in the stone. She thought of the hands that had built and the hands that had unbuilt, and she wondered whether they were the same hands, and if not, whether the unbuilders had known the builders, and how the country had permitted such a thing to happen inside itself, without anyone above ever looking down. She lay back on the bed with her hair loose, and her mother's locket still at her throat, and she slept without dreaming, and Juno slept in the barn, and the country slept, and the church at the bottom of the canyon, whose door had not fully closed for years, waited. Laura woke before Merritt in the blue hour, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed a long time before her boots. She had dreamed after all, she realized, though not of the mounds or the ring. She had dreamed of a woman she did not know braiding a girl's hair by a stove, and of a man's hand setting a plate of biscuits between them, and of the sound of a hymn sung softly and badly in 3 voices, and she could not remember whether the voices had been inside a building or out. She dressed in the dark. She pinned her hair up under her hat. She went into the kitchen and found Merritt already at the table with the lamp lit and a tin cup of coffee steaming in front of an empty chair. "Sit," Merritt said. Laura sat. Merritt pushed the cup toward her. He had cut bread and set salt pork beside it on the tin plate. He did not sit across from her. He stood at the stove with his own cup and looked out the small window at the dark yard, where the cottonwoods stood black against blue. "You'll go down today," Merritt said. It was not a question. Laura drank. "Yes." "Take the rope." "Yes." Merritt was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Your father rode that country the year I was married. He came back once and said there were people down in the folds who wanted to be left alone, and he left them alone. He never told me where. He never told your mother where." Laura set the cup down carefully. "He knew," she said. "He knew something," Merritt said. "Not all of it, not the end of it. He was not that kind of man." Laura waited, but Merritt said nothing further. He came to the table then and cut a second slice of bread, wrapped it in paper, and set it beside her plate. He put his hand on her shoulder once, briefly, and went out to the barn to saddle Juno for her. She rode out with the first gray in the east. The tools were with her again: the axe, the pinch bar, the 40 feet of hemp rope, the short-handled shovel, the muffled hammer. Her father's carbine was slung across her back with a round in the chamber, and the hammer at half-cock. Her mother's silver locket was at her throat. In her coat pocket, wrapped in Hetty's cloth, was bread and hard cheese and a twist of salt, and in the other pocket, her father's small tin of matches and a stub of candle Merritt had put on the table beside her plate without a word. At the second bend, she tied Juno to the scrub cedar for the 3rd time in the same bark-worn place, unsaddled her, and set the saddle up against the cedar. She loosened the halter. Juno lipped her sleeve once, blew warm air into her palm, and turned to the dry grass. Laura stood a moment with her hand on the mare's shoulder, and then walked west along the lip to the bent juniper, to the swale, to the third bench, to the plugged holes and the one iron ring. She uncoiled the rope. She looped it twice around the ring, tied a bowline with the tag end doubled back, and pulled hard against the ring with her whole weight. The ring held. She tested the rope's fall down the face of the bench, and saw that with 40 feet, she could just reach the fourth bench. And from the fourth bench, she judged she could pick her way down on foot to the canyon floor without another line, because the drop broke into ledges, and the ledges into a talus fan that ran clear to the sage. She sat on the third bench with her legs over the edge and looked down. The canyon floor at that hour was still in shadow, but the far wall was catching the first true light, and the light was traveling down the wall a hand's breadth at a time. She could see the sage now more clearly than she had seen it from the nose of rock. She could see the pale stones set in rough rows among the sage. She could see the church. She went down the rope hand over hand, boots braced against the caliche face, and stood on the fourth bench and coiled the rope over her shoulder. She went down the ledges. She went down the talus fan, sliding twice on shifting stone, catching herself on a juniper root the second time. She stepped off the last of the talus onto the canyon floor, and the sage came to her waist, and she stood still and listened. There was no sound, no bird, no insect, no lizard on stone. Only the wind, high above in the cedars along the rim, thin and far. She walked toward the church through the sage. The yard came up to meet her before the building did. The pale stones she had seen from above were graves. They were not carved. They were river stones, rounded and heavy, set upright at the head of each mound, and each mound was outlined at its foot by a smaller ring of the same stones. She counted as she walked. She counted 21. She stopped and counted again, and there were 23, because 2 were smaller and set close, and she had missed them the first time. 2 were the size of a bread loaf. 1 was the size of a fist. Laura knelt at the smallest. She did not touch it. She saw that the mound beneath it was long enough for an infant and no longer. She saw that the ring of footstones was intact. She saw that no wind of 12 or 15 years had moved a single stone. Someone had set them, and someone, for a while at least, had come back and tended them, because there were places where the sage had been broken off short at the mound edges, though the last breaking was old. She stood. She walked to the church door. The door hung on 2 hinges. The upper hinge was sound. The lower hinge had lost a pin, and the door sagged at the corner so that it did not fully close, and the sagging corner rested on a sill worn smooth to a shallow curve by the door's own weight, moving a hand's breadth in the wind, year after year, for she did not know how many years. That was the sound she had heard in the night from the rim. She put her hand flat against the door and pushed. The door swung inward without resistance and without noise, because the sill had been worn smooth by that same motion until nothing scraped. She stood in the doorway. The inside of the church was 1 room. It was not large. There were 6 pews on the left and 6 pews on the right, split down a center aisle floored with hard-packed earth. There was a low platform at the far end, and on the platform a plain plank table, and on the table nothing. Above the table, high on the back wall, a single square of glass had been set into the timber, and through that glass the morning light was coming in, slanting, dust-heavy gold. There was no cross inside. The cross was only on the roof peak, canted outside. Inside there was only the light through the 1 small pane, falling across the platform and across the plank table and onto the dirt of the center aisle in a long, bright rectangle that trembled at the edges as the door moved behind her in the wind. Laura took off her hat. She stood a long time. Then she walked up the aisle, slowly, boots quiet on the packed earth. She stopped at the platform. She put her hand on the plank table. The wood was dry and cool. She looked down at the platform and saw that the boards of the platform were not laid tight. There was a gap of a knuckle's width between two of them, and in the gap was a darker line that was not dust. She knelt on the platform and put her fingers into the gap. She felt the edge of the board give slightly. She stood, went back to the door, and returned with the pinch bar. She set the flat of the bar into the gap and levered gently. The board came up in her hands. She set it aside. Beneath the board was a shallow space, and in the shallow space was a wooden box, the length of her forearm and the width of a Bible, plain, dovetailed at the corners, with a small brass hasp and no lock. Laura lifted the box out. She carried it to the plank table and set it in the rectangle of light, and stood with her hands at her sides. The wood of the box was walnut, oiled once and long since dry. The hasp was tarnished. She put her thumb under the hasp and lifted it. The lid rose without a sound, because the hinges were leather, greased, and had held. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth, was a ledger. She lifted the oilcloth aside. The ledger was bound in dark cloth over boards, and the cloth had faded to the color of old ash, and the corners had been rubbed pale. She opened it. The first page had one line written in a plain hand in brown ink. It read, "We are here because we could not stay there." Beneath that line was a date, and the date was 15 years before the year Laura had come down from the pass, and beneath the date was a list of names. Laura read the names slowly. There were 9 surnames on the first page. Under each surname were given names, some with ages beside them in parentheses, and some without. Under the third surname on the page, she saw a name she knew. A family that had run cattle on the flats north of Willow Bend when she was a small girl. A family her father had spoken of once at supper, and never again. A family whose place had been burned in a year she remembered, because it had been the year her mother had first been sick. Laura turned the page. The second page was a shorter list, and above it was written, "The children born to us here." She read those names. There were 7. 2 had dates of death written after them in the same ink, closer together than any child's dates should be. She turned the page. The third page was a list of deaths. It was longer than the second list. Some of the entries had causes written after them in small letters. Fever, fever, childbed, fall, fever, the winter, the winter, the winter. Others had no cause at all, and beside 3 of those, in a different hand, thinner and more hurried, had been written a single word: shot. Laura sat down on the edge of the platform. She read on. The middle pages of the ledger were an account of the building. They were dated month by month. They said who had cut the timber and where. They said who had carried the nails down from the pass. They said the glass had been brought in a wagon by night from a town Laura had never heard of, and set into the wall by a man whose name she read twice, because it was one of the names on the death page, with the winter written after it. They said the road had been cut in the summer of the first year they were there, and that it had taken them 4 months, and that a man from town, whose name she did not read because it was not written, had come once to look and had gone away, and had come again with 2 others and had gone away again, and had come a 3rd time and had not gone away peacefully. Laura read further. The final pages of the ledger were written in a 4th hand, and this hand was old and shaking and small. This hand said only what happened at the end. It said the families had been told to go, It said some had gone and some had refused. It said the ones who refused had been driven out over 4 nights in the fall of the 12th year, and that the ones who could not run had been shot in their doorways, and that the ones who ran had been chased into the high country, and that the ones who came back to bury the dead had been let to bury them and then told to leave and not return. It said the man who told them was a man in a black frock coat and a gold watch chain, and it said his name. Laura read the name and closed her eyes. The name was not Prewitt Hale. The name was the name of Prewitt Hale's father. She sat on the edge of the platform in the trembling rectangle of light, with the ledger open on her lap. And she understood then, all at once and slowly at the same time, that the road had not been unmade by the people who built it, and that the people who built it had not been the ones who chose to be forgotten. She understood that the mounds along the rim were not the graves of wagons, but the buried iron of the wagons that had carried the last living out, breaking on the ascent, abandoned when the horses could no longer haul them, and later gathered up by the same hands that had pulled the rings and dressed the ruts and scattered the switchback wall, so that no rider on the wash road above would ever have cause to look down and wonder. She understood that the one ring had been left because the one ring could not be pried. She understood that the door had not fully closed because there had been no one left to close it. She understood that the old man on the porch post with pale, washed blue eyes had known all of this and had waited 15 years for someone to come down. She closed the ledger. She wrapped it in the oilcloth. She put it back in the walnut box. She closed the lid and set the hasp. She carried the box up the aisle to the door and set it on the sill in the light. She went back and put the platform board back in its place and set the pinch bar against the platform and stood in the empty room a moment longer, hat in her hand, hair loose at her neck where a pin had slipped, and she said aloud, to no one, in a voice that did not carry beyond the walls, "I know now." The door moved a hand's breadth in the wind and settled, and the rectangle of light on the earth of the aisle trembled and steadied, and outside among the pale river stones, a single small bird she had not heard before called once, and did not call again. Laura stood a while longer in the aisle after she had spoken, the walnut box on the sill in the rectangle of light. The pinch bar leaned against the platform, the ledger inside its oilcloth inside the box. She did not weep. She had not wept at the auctioneer's hammer, and she did not weep in the church. She listened instead, to the door moving a hand's breadth and settling, to the small dry rasp of grit under her own boot when she shifted weight, to the wind above the rim, and under all of it, to nothing. She pinned her hair up again by feel without a mirror, twisting the loose length and setting the pin at the nape of her neck, the way her mother had shown her when Laura had been small enough to sit on a stool between her mother's knees. She put her hat back on. She lifted the walnut box from the sill, tucked it under one arm, and stepped out of the church into the yard among the pale river stones. The morning was farther along than she had thought. The far wall of the canyon was fully lit now, the near wall still in the last of the shadow, and the sage in between held a pale gold cast that made the pale stones stand out sharper. Laura walked to the smallest mound. The one no longer than an infant knelt beside it and set the box down on the sage beside her. She did not touch the stones. She looked at the ring of footstones and at the headstone and at the small space between them, and she said, in the same voice that did not carry, "I am sorry it took so long." She rose. She went to each mound in turn and stood at the foot of it for the space of one breath. She did not count this time. She had counted twice already and knew the number. She only stood, breathed, and moved on. At the 3 mounds where the ledger's thinner hand had written the word shot, She did not know which mounds those were. She stood at every mound the same way and let the not knowing be the shape of it. When she had gone to each, she picked up the walnut box and started back toward the talus fan and the ledges and the rope. The wind changed while she was still in the sage. Laura had grown up under the pass, and she knew the change without having to think about it. The wind that had been coming down the canyon from the high country slackened, hung a moment as if listening, and then began to move the other way, up the canyon from the flats. It carried a different smell with it. It carried the smell of dust ahead of rain. Laura looked up and saw that the strip of sky between the rims had gone from the clean, pale blue of early morning to a bruised color she had not seen when she went into the church. A single cloud she could see the underside of was moving fast against the far rim, and behind it, out of her sight beyond the rim, there would be more. She had time, she judged, but not much of it. She had heard from her father, at Willow Bend when she was 10, that a summer storm in canyon country could put 4 feet of water down a dry wash in the time it took a man to strike a match and see it go out. She did not intend to be in the wash when that happened, and she did not intend to be on the rope on the caliche face either, when the caliche went slick. Laura crossed the sage at a walk that was almost a jog, the walnut box under her arm, the carbine on her back, the coiled rope over her shoulder. At the base of the talus fan, she looked up the slope, judged her line, and started climbing. The stones shifted under her boots the way they had on the way down, but she kept her weight low and her free hand out, and did not fall. Halfway up the fan, she felt the first drop of rain on the back of her hand, cold and heavy. She did not stop. At the ledges, she had to set the walnut box down twice to use both hands. Each time she picked it up again and went on. By the time she reached the foot of the caliche face and the tail end of the hemp rope, the rain was coming steadier, not yet hard, in fat cold drops widely spaced. The caliche under her boots was still dry. She had perhaps a minute, perhaps 2. Laura tied the walnut box into the tail of a shirt she had unwrapped from around the rope for exactly this reason, knotted the sleeves twice, and slung the whole bundle across her chest so that both her hands would be free. She set her boots against the face, took the rope in both hands, and climbed. Halfway up, the caliche went from dry to damp under her palms. 3/4 of the way up, it went from damp to slick. She did not look down. She locked her heels into the ledges her boots had made on the way down, hauled with her arms, and reached the 3rd bench as the rain began in earnest. She lay a moment on her stomach on the 3rd bench, with her cheek against the caliche and her breath going hard and fast in her throat. Then she got up. She did not untie the ring. She did not have time, and she did not want to. She left the rope where it was, tag end doubled through the ring, and she began working her way back up the benches with the box across her chest. The rain was cold, cold enough that her hands stung on the wet stone. Twice on the way up, she slipped and caught herself. Once she went down on one knee hard enough that she felt the bruise begin to set before she had finished getting up. She kept going. She thought as she climbed of the small mound the length of an infant, and of the mound with the fist-sized stone, and of the 7 names on the 2nd ledger page under the heading, "The Children Born to Us Here." She thought of 2 of those names having death dates written close together in the same ink. She came up over the last of the rubble onto the lip and stood in the wind and the rain by the bent juniper. And for the space of one breath, she did not know where she was in the world. Then she saw Juno. The mare was at the end of her tie, ears back, standing sideways to the wind, with her hindquarters braced against the scrub cedar. She was not panicked. She was not pulling. She was only waiting the way an old mare waits, with weight on 3 feet and the fourth cocked, head low, eye white at the corner. Laura went to her at a run and put both hands on her neck and her forehead against the wet, warm hide behind the mare's ear, and Juno breathed out slow and long into Laura's coat. Laura saddled her fast, with the box wrapped inside the coat now against her ribs. She tied the coat closed with a piggin string around her waist so the box would ride flat and dry. She left the axe and the pinch bar and the shovel where they lay beside the cedar. She could not carry them and the box both, and the box was what mattered. She kept the carbine on her back and the rope coiled at the horn and mounted. The rain was hard now. The wash road was already darkening in patches where the caliche was taking the water. Laura turned Juno down the wash and set her at a fast walk, not a trot, because a trot in mud in a wash in canyon country was how horses broke legs and riders broke necks. The mare went willingly. She had been born on hard ground and knew what her feet were for. 2 bends down, Laura saw the wagon. It was a light spring wagon with a canvas top gone dark with water and sagging in the middle. It stood halfway across the wash where the road dipped through the dry creek bed, and the near wheel was down to the hub in wet sand. The near horse, a heavy bay, was on his knees and trying to rise and failing. The off horse was still standing, but shaking. A man was at the near horse's head, hatless, his hair plastered to his skull, pulling at the bridle and shouting something the wind took away. A woman was in the wagon seat with a bundle in her arms that Laura took a moment to understand was a child. Laura recognized none of them. She did not stop to think. She reined Juno up on the low bank above the wash, swung down, tied the mare to a cedar at the height of the bank where the water would not reach even if the wash ran hard, took the coiled rope off the horn, and went down the bank to the wagon. The man saw her come and his face did something Laura did not have time to read. She said, over the rain, "Get her off the seat. Get her up to the bank. My mare is tied there." The man said, "The horse." Laura said, "Off the seat first." The man went. He climbed into the wagon and took the woman by the elbow and half lifted her down over the wheel, and the woman would not let go of the bundle, so he took the bundle from her arm to hers and steadied her. And Laura saw that the woman's boot was turned wrong at the ankle, and that she could not put weight on it. The man got an arm under her shoulders and half carried her up the bank. Laura went to the near horse. The bay was blowing hard. Laura put her hand on the wet neck and spoke to him low, the way her father had taught her when she was small, not words but the tone of words, and the bay's ear came around. She got the rope under the belly on the uphill side, hitched it to the near hame, ran the tag end back to the harness on the off horse, tied it there in a hasty bowline, and then she went to the off horse and put her hand on his neck too and spoke to him. She stepped back and slapped his rump hard once, and both horses gathered themselves. The bay came up out of his knees. The off horse leaned into the collar. The wagon lurched. The near wheel came out of the sand with a wet, dragging sound, and the wagon rolled forward 2 feet and stopped again on higher ground. Laura ran back up the bank. The man was crouched over the woman with the child inside his coat. The wash below them was starting to run. Not the flood yet, but the first thin brown skin of it, moving fast. Laura said, "We cannot stay here. Higher ground, now." The man said, "She cannot walk." Laura said, "My mare can carry her." She untied Juno, brought her, held the mare's head while the man lifted the woman up and set her sideways across the saddle, and then Laura took the bundle from inside the man's coat and held it herself. The child was a boy, perhaps 2 years old, wet and hot with fever, breathing fast and shallow. Laura felt the heat of him through her wet shirt, and knew this was not just the storm. This child had been sick before the storm. This child was why they had been on the road. Laura tucked him inside her own coat against the walnut box and held him there with one arm. She took Juno's reins in her other hand. She said to the man, "Bring the team. Follow me." The man did not argue. He unhitched the wagon horses from the wagon, left the wagon where it was, and led both horses up the bank behind Laura. They went up the wash road at a hard walk, the woman swaying in the saddle, the man beside her with a hand on her thigh to steady her, Laura ahead with the child inside her coat. Half a mile up, on a low shoulder above the wash where a stand of pinyon gave some shelter from the wind, Laura found a place she thought would hold. She helped the man get the woman down. She unslung the carbine and set it against a rock. She untied the coat from her waist and took out the walnut box and set it on a flat stone. She took the child out of her coat and gave him back to his mother. And the mother took him inside her own coat and bent over him and made a sound that was not a word. Laura made a fire. She used the stub of candle Merritt had put on her plate at dawn and the tin of her father's matches from her coat pocket, and a handful of dry needles from the deep underside of the pinyon where the rain had not yet reached, and she built the fire small and hot in the shelter of two rocks. The man watched her do it, and then went and gathered more wood without being told. When the fire was going, Laura stripped her coat off, wrung it out, and put it around the woman's shoulders. She took Hetty's cloth from her other pocket, unwrapped the bread and cheese, and gave the bread to the woman and put the cheese in the man's hand. She uncorked her canteen and gave it to the woman first, and then to the man. She did not eat. She looked at the child. His eyes were half open and did not track. His cheeks were flushed dark under the skin. He was breathing too fast. She put the back of her hand against his forehead, and it was like touching the side of a lamp chimney. Laura said, "How long?" The woman said, 3 days. Laura said, "Where were you going?" The woman said, "Dry Creek. There is a doctor at Willow Bend," they said. "My husband said the road through was shorter." Laura looked at the man. The man looked at the ground. Laura understood he had taken the wash road because it was faster, and because he had not known the country, and because he had been frightened for the child, and had made the choice a frightened man makes. Laura said, "You did right to come. You did wrong to come this way. It does not matter now." She looked at the fire. She looked at the child in the woman's arms. She looked at Juno standing with her head low under a pinyon, water running off her flanks. She looked at the walnut box on the flat stone, wrapped in her coat, the ledger inside it. She had come up out of the canyon that morning with the story of what had been done to 23 people 15 years ago. She had planned, without yet knowing she had planned it, to ride back to Merritt's and sit with him at the kitchen table and put the box between them and begin the slow work of deciding what to do with what she now knew. She had not planned to spend that night on a shoulder above a running wash with a fevered child and 2 strangers whose names she had not yet asked. She looked at the child again. She thought of the small mound the length of an infant. She thought of the 2 death dates written close together in the same ink under the heading, "The children born to us here." Laura said, "He is not going to die tonight. Not here. Not with me." The mother lifted her face out of the child's wet hair and looked at Laura across the fire, and her eyes were the eyes of a person who has not been given a promise in a long time and does not know what to do with one. Laura said it again, quieter, more to herself than to the mother. "Not tonight." She unslung the carbine again, checked the chamber by feel, lowered the hammer to half cock, and set the rifle across her knees where she could reach it without looking. She fed the fire. She did not sleep. The rain came harder for an hour and then eased into a steady cold falling that would go on all night. Below them, the wash ran full and brown, roaring in the narrow places, and Laura understood without needing to look that the rope she had left tied to the iron ring below the third bench was under water now, and that the mounds along the rim were being washed cleaner of their disguise, and that the church at the bottom of the canyon, whose door had not fully closed for 15 years, stood in the same rain with the same door moving a hand's breadth and settling, and that whatever the storm did to the country tonight, it would be doing it in the presence of a witness at last. She held the child's mother's hand across the fire when the mother reached for it, and she held it until the mother's shaking slowed, and she committed herself, in that holding, without saying it aloud, to the whole of what she had found, and to everyone the finding now touched. By the gray of morning, the rain had thinned to a drizzle, and then to a mist that lay along the wash like smoke. The fire had burned to a bed of coals. The boy had slept in fits against his mother's chest, and Laura had listened to his breathing and had counted it once an hour, and by first light his breath had slowed and deepened, and his forehead was still hot, but not as hot as it had been. Laura understood he was not out of the fever, only through the worst hour of the night, and that a doctor was still a day's ride, and that the day's ride was through country softened by rain. The man's name, given at last near dawn when he had asked for water, and Laura had asked in return what to call him, was Amos Fry. His wife was Eleanor. The boy was called Tom for the man's father. They had come down from a soddy at the head of Prickly Draw, 3 days' ride north, where the wife had a sister who had told them of a doctor at Willow Bend, and Amos, wanting to save a day, had cut west through the canyon country on hearsay, and had missed the pass road and come down into the wash. Laura listened to the account without comment. When Amos had finished, Laura said, "There is a doctor at Dry Creek now, nearer than Willow Bend. He rooms at the boarding house Tuesdays." Amos looked at her as a man looks at a stranger who has just handed him back a thing he had lost. Laura saddled Juno at first true light. She put Eleanor sideways in the saddle again, with Tom inside her coat, and put the walnut box tied in the shirt against her own ribs under her coat, as she had before. She led Juno by the reins. Amos led the 2 wagon horses behind them. The wash was still running, though thinner and slower now, and Laura kept them to the shoulder above it. They came down out of the canyon country by mid-morning, and by noon they saw the false fronts of Dry Creek in the flat below. Laura had thought all night about how she would come into town. She had thought she would come in quietly, hand the family to the doctor, ride to Merritt's, and put the walnut box on the kitchen table between them, and only then decide what to do with what was inside it. What she had not planned was that anyone would see her come in, and that the seeing would carry. But hauling day had been Tuesday, and this was Wednesday. And Wednesday in Dry Creek was the morning the mail wagon came in from the pass, and the morning the mercantile took delivery, and the morning half the small ranchers within a day's ride came to town to pick up what they had ordered. As Laura came down the last slope onto the flat, with a mare carrying a hurt woman and a sick child, and a man leading 2 spent wagon horses behind her, and a rifle wrapped in oilcloth across her back, and her hair loose because a pin had slipped in the rain and she had not stopped to fix it, and mud to her knees, and her coat tied at the waist with a piggin string over a walnut box. They were seen by every person on the boardwalk. The tall, pinched woman in the gray shawl stood up out of her chair on the millinery porch. The shorter, red-faced woman set down her cup. The livery boy came out of the wide door of the livery and stood with a currycomb still in his hand. 2 men on the corner of the assay office turned and looked. Hetty Marsh came out onto the boarding house porch, drying her hands on her apron, and stopped there with the cloth twisted between her fingers. Laura did not look at any of them. She led Juno directly to the boarding house porch and stopped at the rail. Hetty came down the steps without speaking and put her hands up for the child. Eleanor let go of Tom into Hetty's arms, as though she had been carrying him since the beginning of the world, and could no longer feel her own hands. Hetty turned with him and called back over her shoulder, in a voice Laura had not heard her use, "Doctor, now, second room." A man Laura had not seen before came out of the boarding house in shirt sleeves with his coat over his arm. He was middle-aged, gray at the temples, with the sort of clean, short-cut hands Laura remembered from the man who had set her father's broken wrist when she was 12. He took Tom from Hetty without breaking stride and went back inside. Hetty went with him. Amos lifted Eleanor down. The livery boy came across the street at a run and took the reins of the 2 wagon horses from Amos without being asked. Amos said, "Their traces are cut. They'll be sore." The livery boy said, "I'll walk them slow." He did not meet Laura's eye, but stood a moment longer than needed with his hand on Juno's neck, and Laura understood that he was saying to the mare, and through the mare to her, what he could not yet say out loud. Laura went inside. In the second room off the hall, the doctor had Tom on the bed and had opened his shirt. Hetty was at the washstand with a basin. The doctor did not look up. He said to Laura without turning, "How long has he been fevered?" 3 days, Laura said. "Hard since yesterday noon." "Any bleeding at the nose or mouth?" "No." "Has he taken water?" "Some. Not much." The doctor nodded once. He said, "Go get me warm water and a clean cloth," and Hetty was already moving. He said to Eleanor gently, "Sit down, ma'am. He is with me now." Eleanor sat down in the chair by the window and put her face in her hands. Laura stepped back into the hall. She untied the piggin string at her waist, took the walnut box out of her coat, and stood in the hallway holding it. Her coat was black with wet and cold. Her hair was down over one shoulder. She was aware that she was shaking and that she had not eaten since noon of the day before. Hetty came back out of the room with a pitcher and stopped when she saw Laura. Hetty said quietly, "Sit down before you fall down." She took Laura by the elbow with her free hand and steered her into the kitchen and set her in a chair by the stove. She poured coffee from the pot on the back of the stove into a tin cup and set it in Laura's hands and closed Laura's fingers around it. She said, "Drink it," and went back down the hall with the pitcher. Laura drank. The coffee was bitter and old and hot. She held the walnut box on her lap under the edge of the table. After some minutes, the old man with pale, washed blue eyes came in from the porch. He had his hat in his hand. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at Laura and at the box, and did not speak for a long time. Then he came in and sat down across from her at the small kitchen table where Hetty kneaded bread, and he set his hat on the table beside him, and he said, "You went down." "I went down," Laura said. "You brought it up." "I brought it up." The old man looked at the box. He said, "Open it." Laura opened it. She took out the ledger in its oilcloth, unwrapped it, and laid it on the table between them, and turned the cover back. The old man did not touch it. He read the first line, and the date under it, and the list of 9 surnames, and he closed his eyes a moment, and Laura saw water come up in the corners of them and stay there without falling. He said at last, "My sister's name is on this page." Laura waited. The old man put one finger on the page under a name Laura had already read twice without knowing whose it was. He said, She was married to the second man on the death list. He was shot at his own doorway in the fall of the 12th year. She was one of the ones who came back to bury the dead. She was told to leave and not return, and she left, and she did not return, and she died in a rooming house in Kansas the winter after. And I could not go to her because I did not know where she had gone, and no one would tell me. And by the time I learned it, she was in the ground. He took his finger off the page. He said, I came back here 15 years ago to find out. I have been in this town 15 years, on that porch, at that supper table, and I have not been able to make anyone say the word. I did not go down myself because I am an old man, and I would not have come back up, and because I thought, if I went down and did not come back up, no one would ever know what was down there. So I waited. I told every rider who ever sat on that porch about the roof in the fold. Most laughed, some did not hear. 2 rode past and looked and rode on. You are the first who went down. Laura did not answer. She turned the ledger to the page of the children born, and then to the last pages in the shaking hand, and let the old man read until he had read the name of the man in the black frock coat and the gold watch chain. His hand tightened on the edge of the table. He said, That is the father of the man who bought your father's place. Yes, Laura said. He is dead. 11 years. Yes. His son does not know. Laura looked at the old man. She said, I think he does not. The old man was quiet a long time. Then he said, It will be worse for him to be told than not to have known. That is not our concern. Laura said, No. Hetty came into the kitchen. She said, The doctor says the boy will keep. Fever is breaking. He wants him kept quiet 3 days. She looked at the ledger on the table and did not ask. She said to Laura, Your uncle is on the porch. Laura went out. Merritt was standing at the porch rail with his hat in his hand, and rain still on the shoulders of his coat, though it was not raining in town. He had ridden down from the holding when Juno had not come in by dark the night before, and he had slept in a barn along the road, and he had come on at first light, and he had come into town not 5 minutes behind her without her knowing it. He looked at her, and he looked at Juno at the rail, and he looked at the mud on Laura's boots to her knees, and he said, You are all right. I am all right, Laura said. Whose child? Amos Fry, out of Prickly Draw. Merritt nodded. He said, You found what you were looking for? I found more than that, he said. Show me when there is time. And that was all he said, and Laura understood that he had known, in the way Merritt knew things, from the moment he had put the tin cup of coffee in front of her at dawn the day before, and had told her to take the rope, and had cut the larger piece of salt pork onto her plate. She put her hand on his sleeve, and he covered her hand with his, and they stood a moment on the porch and did not speak. By afternoon, the town knew that Merritt Shaw's niece had brought a family out of the canyon country in the storm and had saved a fevered child, and by evening the town knew that she had also brought up a wooden box out of somewhere she would not yet say. And by the next morning the town knew, because Amos Fry had spoken plainly at the livery about what Laura had done at the wagon and on the shoulder above the wash, that the young woman they had watched come down out of the flats the day before, muddy and hatless and unsmiling, had done a thing that most men in that country would not have done, and would not have done well. The tall, pinched woman in the gray shawl did not speak of Laura again on the millinery porch. When Laura passed the porch that Friday on her way to the mercantile, the woman looked down at her hands. The shorter, red-faced woman rose slightly from her chair and said, "Good morning, Miss Shaw," in a small voice, and Laura returned the greeting evenly and went on. The livery boy, whose name Laura learned that week was Nate, would not take payment for Juno's stall, And when Laura pressed a coin into his palm, he closed his fingers around it and looked at the ground and said, "For the mayor, not for me." Laura let him have it that way. The doctor, whose name was Halloran, and who rode circuit between Dry Creek and Willow Bend, on a schedule Laura had not previously understood, sat with Laura on Saturday morning in Hetty's kitchen with a cup of coffee between them and the ledger open on the table. He turned the pages carefully with the tips of his fingers, and at the death page he stopped and read the causes down the column and did not speak for a full minute. Then he said, "Fever in a place with no doctor, childbed with no midwife but each other, a fall with no one to set the bone, the winter 3 times. He looked up. He said, "Miss Shaw, whatever else this ledger is, it is also an honest medical record kept by people who had no one to keep it for them. I would like, with your permission, to copy the medical pages, not for print, for the record, so that these deaths are counted somewhere." Laura said yes. He said, "And the 3 marked shot. I have known for 11 years that there were people missing from this country who were not accounted for. I did not know where they had gone." He closed the ledger gently. He said, "You have done a thing today, Miss Shaw, that a great many people in this country have failed to do, myself among them. I am grateful to you." Laura did not know what to say to that, so she said, "Thank you, Doctor." And it was enough. Word of the ledger moved out of Dry Creek along the mail road and along the pass road within a week. On the following Tuesday, a man Laura had never seen rode in from the north on a bay gelding and asked at the boarding house for Miss Shaw. He was thin and gray and wore a coat that had once been good, and he introduced himself as the brother of the 4th surname on the first page of the ledger. And he had ridden down from a homestead 2 days north because a cousin of his had heard from a drummer that a young woman in Dry Creek had brought a book up out of the canyon with his brother's name in it. Laura took him into Hetty's parlor and opened the ledger on the small table and let him read. He read for 2 hours. When he was done, he closed the ledger and put both hands flat on its cover and bent his head and did not weep, though his shoulders moved once. He said, "I did not know where he was buried. I have not known for 15 years. I would like to see the place." Laura said she would take him. Others came after him. In the 3 weeks that followed, 7 people came into Dry Creek asking for Miss Shaw, and each of them read the ledger in Hetty's parlor. And to each of them Laura offered to ride up the wash and show them the place, and each of them accepted. Merritt rode with her on those trips. They did not go down into the canyon. They stood on the nose of rock and looked down at the church roof and the canted cross and the pale stones in rough rows among the sage, and Laura told each visitor what she had found and how she had found it. And each visitor stood quiet a long time and then said thank you and rode away. Prewitt Hale came to the boarding house on the 4th Friday. He came alone, on foot, without his hat, in a plain, dark coat without cufflinks, and he asked at the porch if he might speak with Miss Shaw. Hetty went and got Laura. Laura came onto the porch and did not sit. Prewitt did not sit. He stood at the rail with his hands folded in front of him, and he said, in a voice much smaller than the one he had used at the corner 4 weeks before, "I have been told what is in the book. I have read the pages that pertain to my father. I have not slept 2 nights running. I will not ask you not to speak of it. I will not ask you to soften it. I would only ask, Miss Shaw, whether there is anything I might do at this distance that would not be an insult." Laura looked at him. She saw a man who had inherited a name and a watch chain and a set of certainties, and had that morning laid 2 of the 3 down and did not know yet what to do with the 3rd. she said, "the graves are on your father's ledger. They are not on any deed of yours or any deed of mine. But someone should see to them. The stones are set. The sage should be kept back. The road down should not be opened again." Prewitt said, "I will pay for the keeping." "You will not pay," Laura said. "You will send a man twice a year to clear the sage. I will tell you when. The man will not be told why." Prewitt looked at her a long moment. He said, "That is fair." Laura said, "Mr. Hale, my father said well enough to yours because he meant it. He did not know what your father had done. If he had known, he would not have sat on the same porch with him. That is the last I will say of my father to you." Prewitt inclined his head, and Laura understood that she had given him the one gift within her power to give, which was a way to leave the porch without being followed by laughter. And he understood it too, and he took it, and he touched the brim of a hat he was not wearing, and turned and went down the steps and walked back up the street the way he had come. The two men on the corner of the assay office who had not laughed a month before were on the corner that afternoon, and they watched Prewitt Hale walk past them without meeting their eyes, and one of them, the one who had turned his face away, took his own hat off as Laura came out of the boarding house and put it back on when she had passed, and Laura, walking to the livery to see to Juno, understood that the chorus had shifted, and that the shift had not been demanded and had not been announced, and that it would hold. By the end of that autumn, the cottonwoods along the wash had gone gold and then bare, and the first thin skin of ice had come to the horse trough at Merritt's Holding before it broke off again in the warm spells. Tom Fry was walking. Amos and Eleanor had gone north to Prickly Draw with a wagon Merritt lent them and a promise to come back in the spring. The ledger was in a locked drawer in Hetty's parlor, where any of the 9 surnames could ask to see it, and none other. Dr. Halloran had finished his copying and taken it away. The old man with pale, washed blue eyes had died in his chair on the boarding house porch on a Tuesday in October, and Laura had helped Hetty lay him out, and he had been buried at Willow Bend with a stone Laura paid for out of her own wages, which she was now earning honestly from Merritt on the holding. On the last warm evening of the year, Laura rode Juno up the wash alone. She went as far as the second bend and no farther. She did not go out onto the nose of rock. She sat on Juno at the trail and looked west, where the sun was setting behind the far rim, and the light came down the canyon in the color of copper, turning to bronze, turning to iron, and she could not see the church, but knew it was there, its door moving a hand's breadth in the wind and settling, its yard kept clear of sage by a man twice a year who did not know why. Laura put her hand on Juno's neck. She said, quiet enough that only the mare heard, "I did not inherit a place. I inherited a listening." She turned Juno and rode home in the blue hour. "Thank you for staying to the end of this one. If Laura's quiet finding stayed with you, this story of what is buried and what is finally heard, leave a kind word below, tap the like, and follow along. Next time, a widow, a locked barn, and a horse no one else would keep. Ride safe until then.